Can DNA solve the mystery of Europe's elongated skulls? August 25, 2019. A new genomic study tries to see if there is a correlation between artificial cranial deformation and migration after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The DNA analysis of two artificially deformed skulls, published in PLOS One magazine, has now revealed another curious fact. The three boys buried together all had dramatically different genetic origins. One of them, with no skull modifications, was of Western Eurasian descent, the teenager with the slightly elongated skull was of Middle Eastern descent, and the boy who had a very elongated skull was of Eastern Asian ancestry. Senior author Mario Novak of the Anthropological Research Institute in Zagreb, Croatia said, "When we got the results from the old DNA, we were surprised. It is obvious that different people lived in this part of Europe and interacted very closely with each other. Perhaps they used artificial cranial deformation as a visual indicator of belonging to a specific cultural group." Artificial cranial deformation (ACD) involves the binding of a child's head from childhood to deform the skull, and is a form of body modification that has been practiced since at least the Neolithic period in cultures throughout the world. In Europe, the practice of CDA appeared around the Black Sea in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, reached a high point in the 5th and 6th centuries, and disappeared in the late 7th century, says Suzanne Hakenbeck, a historical archaeologist at Cambridge University, who studied skull modification in Europe. Hakenbeck was not involved in the study. According to Novak, about a dozen ACD skulls have been found in Croatia outside of Hermano-Vinograd, but no scientific studies on these skulls have been published to date. Meet the Huns. Novak and his colleagues think their findings support a long-standing theory that the Huns, a nomadic horse-mounted confederation that some believe originated in East Asia, introduced cranial deformation in Central Europe. Novak says, "For the first time, we now have physical and biological evidence of the presence of the East Asian people, probably the Huns, in this part of Europe, based on ancient DNA results." However, the exact homeland of the Huns is a matter of debate among archaeologists, and other scholars have suggested that this group came not from East Asia, but from the North Black Sea. Genetic data alone cannot prove either that a specific individual from the past, such as the elongated skull boy in Hermano-Vinograd, would have identified himself as a Hun, which Novak is quick to recognize. Novak says, "I would not say that we can say, based on ancient DNA, that this is an Ostrogoth or that person is a Hun. It also depends on how people felt about themselves, which is quite subjective, and it is almost impossible to find out without written sources, something the Huns did not leave." After studying the spread of ACD skulls discovered in Europe and Eurasia, Hakenbeck does not believe there is an exclusive link between Huns and the practice. She said, "It is more likely that the practice has come to Europe through connections with Eurasian steppes that are not necessarily historically attested. The Huns may have contributed, but they were not alone." More amazing stories. How teenagers were buried together in the hole is still a mystery. Hermano-Vinograd is the site of a large Neolithic settlement, but there is no settlement of the migration period in the immediate vicinity. The one-time burial was not part of any larger, established cemetery, and perhaps it was linked to a nomadic community or group of people living elsewhere. Novak says, "The boys had similar diets in their later years, suggesting that they lived in the same place for some time. They were buried with horse and pig bones, and their cause of death is unclear." Although the incomplete skeletal remains show no sign of violent death, the researchers think it is possible that the teenagers were killed in some kind of ritual, or that they died of plague or other illness that they killed quickly. Krishna Virama, a geneticist at Stony Brook University in New York who was not involved in the study, wrote, "The caveat is that this is a small sample size, it's just a funeral and we don't have much information about what it is. But still, it's interesting that you have this diversity." Last year, Virama and his colleagues published a study analyzing the DNA of artificially deformed women who had been buried in southern Germany during the migration period. These women had very diverse genetic backgrounds, including possible components of East Asian ancestors, and one possible explanation for this pattern is that women with modified skulls migrated westward due to marriage. According to Hakenbeck, most individuals with modified skulls in Europe and Western Eurasia are female, at a ratio of 2:1. Novak says that with more samples, researchers could get a more accurate resolution of where ACD practitioners came from and find out if it was really a visual indicator of association with a certain cultural group. There has not been much work on studying the DNA of individuals with elongated skulls, and the European migration period has not been very well covered in the large amount of older DNA studies that have been published in the last 2 decades, says Ron Pinhasi of the University from Vienna, another senior author of the new study. Pinhasi said about genetic studies, "We know a lot more about what happened 5,000 years ago in Europe than we know what happened 1,500 years ago in Europe." However, he thinks this is starting to change and expects to see more research into DNA samples from the last 2,000 years. He said, "I think we'll find much more amazing stories, and perhaps when they are together we will have a very different understanding of the migration period."